a lot of writers and a lot of directors and people whose work I produce, but also people who I speak to at like networking events and whatever. They'll come to me and they'll say, you know, how can I get my film into your festival? And I say, well, I don't know. I'm not really sure. Like, it has to be really good for a start. I have to want to see it. I have to like it, but it kind of has to fit in with everything else, and that's not something I can predict for you like a year and a half out.
In today's episode, I caught up with Gerry Maguire, the head of Irish Film London, an organisation that promotes and offers a platform for Irish film across the UK. Gerry says it's just so culturally important and has become an exciting thing, not only to have the responsibility of leading this organisation, but also just to be connected to people who are at home. Gerry began by telling me how he started in the industry since moving from Ireland, from becoming a producer to working on the film festival circuit, as well as his current role. The conversation was recorded early in the year, so keep that in mind. Over to you, Gerry.
I'm a film producer who came into the industry through that sort of a traditional route. Like, I went to film school and started interning and started working in development and production roles in people's production offices. And through my freelance gigs, I've sort of went into the exhibition industry as well, working for festivals and delivering events. And the position I'm in now is as the head of a film festival organisation. It's called Irish Film London, and its purpose is really to promote and make sure that there's a platform for Irish film in London and across the rest of the UK. I've taken on a number of different festival roles over the years. It's always kind of been in festival management or coordination capacity. And when I moved to London a number of years ago, one of the jobs that I picked up was a festival producing role with an organisation called London Short Film Festival. So it's a festival that I had screened some of my work at before, and I knew them and I knew some of the people that worked there, and it was exciting to work with them. But it was a lot of responsibility, and even though I'd been a producer on a film, on lots of films before, I hadn't really taken into account what it meant to be a producer of a film festival. It's a very different role, and it was a bit of a learning curve for me actually going through that. So an opportunity came up in December to take over at the Irish Film London organisation, and I considered it for a long time and thought, well, I don't really want to move away from all these cool, exciting projects that I have. But the more that I spoke to people about it and the more that I got interested in what the organisation was doing, the more I realised that it was actually a really, really good fit for me. As well as all the kind of festival management experience and stuff that I've got, there's an element of being connected to the Irish industry that was super appealing to me. And it made me realise that up until in this role, my connection to the Irish industry has actually been fairly piecemeal. I've like really focused on people in my local area. So it was in the northeast of England first, and then it was in London, in that little London filmmaking ecosystem. But I never really branched out properly and made friends in Ireland and accessed support from Ireland and everything. And of course, Ireland's got this amazing, really well-developed film industry. Like, they're churning out so much great material all the time due to the investment and the infrastructure that's been built around it. And it's just so culturally important. It's become a really, really exciting thing for me, not only to have the responsibility of leading this organisation, but also just to be connected to people who are, quote unquote, at home in this bigger and more meaningful way.
It's been a difficult time for most venues, but I wanted to understand some of the general challenges for film programming and how this has changed in the last couple of years.
I think film festivals have a really specific set of challenges that are, there's challenges for everyone right now. In 2021, there's challenges around opening up the industry again and how we open up and how we get back to work and how we bounce back from this long closure period. In many ways, the challenges that we would have had in 2019 are kind of amplified by that stress right now. And those are things like, most cultural organizations are reliant to a large degree on statutory funding or, public funding, grants and little bits of like money to run projects that are specific in nature. And oftentimes that's augmented by your box office earnings or what you can take in from, in the case of a not-for-profit like Irish Film London, it's often donations and stuff like that. With venues closed, there's no box office revenue. When people are out of work, there's not really a donation stream. So obviously the biggest stress for everyone at the moment is just keeping their head above water and surviving. I mean, I think more traditionally speaking, the big challenge for any festival is always the quality of programming that we present. In many ways, the programming job at Irish Film London is a relatively easy one in the sense that my job is to present the very best new Irish film to audiences in London, and because we now have an online platform, to audiences in the UK and sometimes all over the world. That job is made easier by the fact that in the festival calendar, our main festival happens at the end of November. We have smaller ones around St. Bridget's Day, which is a festival of like female film coming from Ireland, and we have a big St. Patrick's Day celebration that we do as we're like the official film partners of the Mayor of London's St. Patrick's festivities. But our big festival event is in November. And because it's in November, I've got the pick of what's already happened in the year at Dublin Film Festival, at the Galway Film Fleadh, at Cork, Kerry, Belfast Film Festival, and all of the best Irish films from there. Hopefully I've had a chance to see them through the year and present them to audiences in the UK in November. And of course, our festival takes place just after the big BFI London Film Festival. So there's often a little sort of a bounce that we get from the publicity that some Irish films get at the London Film Festival, which we then show for our slightly more community-focused festival. So programming's always the biggest consideration in terms of what events you're going to put on. This year, and I haven't figured out whether this is a good or a bad thing yet, but this year, no one's been able to screen a film in the cinema for like a year and a half. Any films that came out when cinemas opened briefly in the UK last year were kind of reruns or like things that had been like big blockbuster tentpoles that had been sent out again to try and get bums on seats, right? Now we've got like almost 2 years worth of a back catalogue of stuff that's never been seen. Some of it's being released for the first time, some of it's being re-released. And we've got to decide which of those films we present to our audiences in November. But at the same time, there's also films which were maybe shot before lockdown or during lockdown in some instances, which have gone through their post-production process, and they're the real new films of 2021. And we need to have a space for them as well.
Gerry continues by talking about the process of programming, particularly in the context of Irish film industry, as well as how his experience as a producer has helped in this role as a programmer.
I think because we're so like culturally focused, what we program is, in a sense, it's quite niche. And like we're only showing Irish films at our film festival, so that really does reduce us down to films shot in Ireland, films shot by Irish filmmakers somewhere else, or films which feature like a big Irish star or stars, right? But what that does mean is that we can be really diverse in the kind of things that we program. When you submit your film to us, we don't care really if it's a drama or if it's a thriller or if it's a documentary or an animation. In fact, we quite like to be able to show a lot of all of those if we can. We don't necessarily need your film to be super commercial. We don't necessarily want it to be mega experimental, but we know that there's an audience within the people who attend our events for all of those things. Again, it's like one of these things where we can be quite flexible and we can be quite open about the things that we accept in our festival. In other places that I've worked, there's definitely been a voice of the festival or I guess a film has to feel like it's a part of that festival. And the way I would describe that is, like, if I look at the competition winners from like any other festival that I've worked at that's got this specific programming voice, it's normally the competition winners and the ones that are in competition, if there is a competition strand, that I can look to and say, okay, that's a very specific thing that they've chosen year on year to represent what they feel is like the cream of the crop. And that's very different across lots of different festivals. And I think that you can look at those examples and say to yourself, is my film a good fit for this festival? Is this worth the entry fee for me? Is it a broad enough appeal or broad enough programming, like decision-making process that I think I have a chance of getting in there? As a producer, one of the things that this festival work has taught me is to really, really work on the festival strategy side of my film's release. And I would absolutely encourage everybody to focus on that before they just kind of splurge all their money out on like 100 different film festivals. Not only are you probably going to get rejected a lot more, but it's going to cost you a lot of money to get into those good ones. And it's really, really, really worth considering whether your film's a good fit. I mean, if you have like an urban, low-budget comedy film that's set in like a flat in London, you're probably not going to do well at like the surf festival that's down on the coast, you know? I mean, unless it's very specifically about some guys who are surfers or whatever, you know, but that's just like, it's a really obvious example. The less obvious example is if your film has a certain theme and you think that you want to exploit that theme in your festival strategy, focus on that rather than saying, I would love for this film to be seen in competition at Sundance or in competition at, you know, Aesthetica or somewhere else. You know, I'm just kind of naming festivals at random here. But like, you've really got to consider whether you've got a chance of paying the entry fee and getting your film in the first instance.
Hi, Gerry, what is that the film programmer wants when looking at submissions, and is there a clear way how to get into one?
I think knowing what a festival programmer wants is really only part of the battle, though. It's like a festival a festival committee might turn around and say, this is the kind of thing on paper that we want to see. But what they can screen and what works in a program is very much dependent on what's out there for them to program. So most festivals are going to want to show brand new stuff. In any given year, you're going to get a number of filmmakers who all have their own ideas about what film they're going to make, and financiers that decide what they want to put their investment into, and sales agents and distributors that decide whether or not there's an audience for it, and so on. And what that means at the programming side, you're at the very end of the film value chain. So all those creative decisions have been made in advance. By the time you get to the festival programming place, you've got to make your decisions based on what's already there in the market, and then you've got decisions to make around what looks good together in a program. So I might have there might be a real thing for horror, you know, like sometimes you see like cycles of genres coming through in big numbers, and there might be like a trend for certain types of horror films. And during those years, the festivals that do well with their horror sections are going to have a bumper choice, and they're probably going to have a really easy time of deciding what great films go into their festival. But because of that, a lot of filmmakers will maybe decide to jump on that bandwagon and move away from some other kind of content. Thankfully, it's very pluralistic in our industry, and we have filmmakers of all shapes, sizes, and you know, backgrounds and stuff that want to make loads of different things. So there's usually a pretty good choice all across the board. And it's also, I think it's more about like a programmer's job is to try and preempt what people's taste is. And we don't know what their taste is until we get their feedback when they've finally seen it. This is why sometimes you go to a festival and you see a film that you don't like. And you wonder, well, how did they program that? Why did my film not get in, but this one did? Well, that's because you've got different tastes and some people might like it. And also the programmers might have thought, do you know what? This would go really well with this other film that we're showing and we can make a little strand out of it. But you might not see that other film. You might not enjoy that strand. And yeah, that might just be actually a bad decision on someone else's part. But yeah, it's also a very creative process, just as much as the filmmaking is. The film curation side of things is a creative process as well. You know, just like any creatives, it's not always something you can get right for everyone. A lot of writers and a lot of directors and people whose work I produce, but also people who I speak to at like networking events and whatever, they'll come to me and they'll say, you know, how can I get my film into your festival? And it's like, well, I don't know. I'm not really sure. Like, it has to be really good for a start. I have to want to see it. I have to like it. But it kind of has to fit in with everything else. And that's not something I can predict for you like a year and a half out, you know? If we were able to shoot films and have them completed within like a couple of days, you could turn around to me if you knew me really well and say, oh, what have you got in your festival? What are you missing? And maybe I'd take your, like, I don't know, what would that be? Like some AI generated, like off the cuff film. And I'd be like, all right, cool, that's fine. Yeah, I'll stick that in for a laugh. Probably wouldn't be any good though. So yeah, just stick to what you do best.
I also wanted to know, what are some of Gerry's pet peeves when it comes to filmmakers and film festivals?
This is a great thing for me to talk about. Okay, so one of my pet peeves as a programmer or as a festival manager or whatever is when we get your film in and we reach out to you and, you know, you've made the work of submitting it to the festival, probably spent some money on submitting it and putting all the promotional materials together and everything. And we pick it up and we say, we'd love to feature this in our program, whether it's online or in the cinema or whatever, and we're going to give you a platform for it. And you get back to us and you say, that's really cool, thank you. Here's the screening file and here's what you need for it and blah, blah, blah. And we go, great, cool. It's going up on this date. Make sure you tell people about it and come down and there's a ticket for you at the bar and stuff like this. And then they don't do anything. Like, there's no self-promotion and there's no kind of investment in this opportunity that we're providing. And like, that's just so disheartening for me. Sometimes, you know, credit where it's due, a lot of filmmakers who are on the festival circuit are there because they really need their work to be promoted, but at the same time, they need to pay their bills. They need to work and they need to, you know, get those invoices paid and everything. Trust me, I know all about that. I'm one of those people too. But it's just really disappointing sometimes when we get films that come onto our platforms or into the screenings that we work really hard on, and there's not really any work done on the filmmaker's side to say, thank you for this opportunity. Here, you know, we're on board with this opportunity and we're here to celebrate it with you. And, you know, it's not to sound really kind of, I don't want to sound like I'm coming from a too privileged of a position here, but from a commercial perspective, running an organization, we don't need to use your film. We've probably made a decision curatorially to make an offer to you at the expense of someone else. And that, if I find out that someone else would have come and, you know, brought all their friends to come and see it and like celebrated with us and, you know, come down and taken pictures and offered us the support, and it makes me really disappointed to think that that's not going to happen. I think that, like, it's a different deal when you're on a red carpet at some really big event where, you know, you're part of the literati, and there's a sort of I think maybe there is this privileged approach to things where you're like, yeah, I've made it. I'm one of the guys now, and we're here to celebrate. And I'm going to try and keep a straight face and smile for the camera and stuff like that. That's cool. And if you're one of those people, that's fine. That's who you are and where you are. But at my festival, we have a red carpet event. We expect people to turn up and be happy to be there. And I think that if your film's going to be in the festival, I want to know that you're invested in being there and celebrating it with us too. And it's kind of like one of my pet peeves as a programmer. In the films that I send to festivals, I always make an effort to jump on my social medias and let people know that it's there. And yeah, it's disappointing when other people don't bother to do that.
I was curious to find out what are some of Gerry's favorite films. He told me about the screening of the Georgian film Corn Island, his meeting with its director, and how it went to influence his own work.
A number of years ago, I got my pass to go to the BFI London Film Festival, and I was super excited, and I decided to go and watch a few films. But more than anything, I had this login to go into like the media library, so you could see some of the online like industry screeners, and I was kind of excited about what was on there and watched a few of the ones that I expected to be really good, and got to the stage of just kind of browsing the rest of the library, and I came across this really interesting title called Corn Island, and it was a film by a Georgian filmmaker, and apologies if I get his name wrong, but I think his name is Gerry Abrashvili, or I thought it was George Abrashvili at the time, but I think it's pronounced Yorgi or Yorgi. So I'd never seen a Georgian film before at this stage, and I didn't know about him or anything that he did. And I started to watch this film just blind, like hadn't heard anything, read anything about it. And it was this incredibly beautiful story about an island that is created in the middle of a river when the glaciers melt, and it creates this silt island, and the farmers in this region are allowed to come and farm these artificial islands for a season before they wash away again. And it was also this story about like this coming of age story about a young girl who was there with her grandfather. And it was very much a film that like nobody said anything in that film until about 40 minutes in. And it was all like the power of the images was what really kept you going through that first 40 minutes. And the dialogue was very kind of like secondary to what was happening in this purely cinematic space. And I just fell in love with this film so much. It came to the stage years and years later where I'd been talking to people about, this is my favourite film I've ever seen at a festival. I had the chance to go to the Sofia meetings at the Sofia Film Festival in Bulgaria. And at the table across from me, everyone was like swarming around this guy who had a new film in competition, and like shaking hands and having drinks and so on. And someone says, "Oh, do you want to come and meet Mr. Abrashvili?" And I'm like, "What? Yes, of course, I really do. I must tell him how I saw his film and I fell in love with Georgian cinema through this one experience of seeing his film in the industry program. When I'm on set making a film and there's some stars involved and some actors that you would recognize and you're happy to be there with, you're like, oh, that's cool, okay, but it's a professional thing and I'm gonna keep my head on and not ask them to take selfies and sign autographs and stuff like that. But this time I was just like, man, I've got to talk to you about your film. Like, this is so exciting for me. I've got to talk to you about it. And I just had to we sat together and we had some drinks and talked about how, Georgian cinema was a thing that was developing and the industry and the impact of Corn Island and so on. And I think the point of that story is that, George's film wasn't officially screening in the festival program, but his producers were smart enough to put it into the industry program and make it available for buyers and programmers to watch. And I happened to have access to it, and it just exploded my view of what cinema was and what European cinema was, and that Georgian cinema existed. It's just a really beautiful thing, and I was so pleased to have the opportunity to meet him in person and be able to close that circle a little bit, Last year, in the middle of the pandemic, there was this documentary I was working on, which was kind of like a rescue documentary that we kind of took out of an artist's archives. And he had actually shot it like 10, 15 years ago, but it had never been seen. It had never really had a screening. So we repackaged it and remastered it. And we stuck it into some industry programs, like some industry screening events at some of the big European documentary markets, which of course were all online that year anyway. And it was so interesting that we were able to get this film seen by people who would never have been able to see it before. So it felt like I was doing the same thing with that documentary that the Corn Island filmmakers had done with theirs. And it felt like there were conversations being generated about this really niche, sort of DIY, like handycam documentary that no one was ever going to see otherwise, that were made possible by the fact that these programs existed. And it felt really interesting and exciting. We ended up getting it on a VOD platform in the US, so it's available to watch now. But it's something that I don't think I would have seen the value of doing that if it hadn't been for that previous festival experience. I think that's maybe something that's like a bit obvious to some people, like make sure that you get it seen. But there's different ways to get your film seen. I think it doesn't have to be a case of it must play in competition or it must be an official selection somewhere. A short filmmaker, for example, like will submit their film to probably a lot more festivals than feature filmmakers, just because there's lots more short films festivals out there, and it's maybe a little bit more affordable to get it in. There's some of the really, really big ones like Clermont-Ferrand. Even if you submit, even if you're not selected, your film's available in their library, in their catalogue, for everyone across the world to see. And if you describe it properly and put it in there properly, it will get attention.
Finally, Gerry expanded on the ways in which a film release strategy can be used and still remains relevant in an ever-changing landscape of online content and new digital platforms.
Traditionally, in the festival world, the way that you approached a release strategy for your film as a distributor or a producer or whatever is you get your film released theatrically, and then there's like a physical release where it goes onto DVD or Blu-ray and like Asda or whatever. And then maybe a year later or something like that, you get some TV rights that are sold so people at home who pay a license fee for their television can watch it on terrestrial TV. And of course, that doesn't really exist like that anymore. There's this company called Netflix that you might have heard of, and they've like completely exploded this model. It's completely different now. And I think that they probably like have always planned to do this, but I've been really paying attention to what they've been doing in the last few years. It's been so interesting. They've completely collapsed what we call the theatrical release window. So, and they did this, I think the biggest like eye-opening thing for me was The Irishman, which was the big Scorsese film, which from day one was going to be like a huge Netflix film that was going to be released on Netflix. I watched it first on Netflix. And some people, maybe they're a bit more of like puritanical about their cinematic experience, but they had to wait to see it in the theatre. I have a Netflix subscription, so I watched it on Netflix. Really enjoyed it. Not Scorsese's best work, I don't think, but I really enjoyed it. And then, there's lots and lots and lots of other films that were released around that same time, which the idea was they're Netflix films, so they're all obviously going to be on Netflix, but there's going to be a small theatrical release window for them. And what that does is it says, okay, it's definitely being released. It's definitely out there in the cinema, but it's almost instantly available to watch on Netflix at the same time. And that caused a lot of controversy. But from my perspective, what that also causes is choice for an audience member. And this very traditional thing of like, we must have a theatrical release window first so that we can get £15 per head of a ticket for a 300-seat auditorium and make loads of money on like hundreds of things and have this sort of exclusive premiere release, that doesn't exist anymore. So from a festival perspective, we've kind of embraced that. Like, you know, we didn't have an opportunity to screen films in cinemas with our like cinema venue partners this last 18 months. So we created our own platform. We used one of the many kind of build your own VOD platform things that are out there for festivals. We use one called Eventive, and we've created our own platform, and it does exactly what we need it to do to help connect with people. It's called Irish Film from Home, and it's accessible via the Irish Film London website, but it's also accessible just from like a Google search, I guess. And it's been the way that we show films to people during lockdown. Now, the other side of this conversation is that things were already going in this direction, but there's been major debates in the, like, there's been some very specific releases in the last 18 months where the studios have completely fallen out with distributors and exhibitors who have said, we're not going to do a proper window for this. You're going to have to suck it up. And like, for example, I think AMC cinemas have like fallen out with one of the big studios, and it's like, yeah, whatever, no one's going to win that except the audience at the end of the day. What the pandemic has done is said, when people are stuck at home and they need a platform to find that content, obviously the big players have almost monopolized the market. Like the introduction of Disney Plus has been a huge thing. Netflix, Amazon, Apple, whatever, like there's all that content is there now. But if we want to remain relevant in that conversation, we have to provide content online as well. What we're all talking about in the festival sphere now is how our business models are based on showing films in theaters, and that's how we're going to make our money again in the second half of this year. And all my fingers and toes are crossed for the cinemas remaining opening. But during that time, those VOD platforms are not going away. So Irish Film from Home is not going away. When I do a screening in a London cinema for a London audience, I can reach people in London, but I want to reach people all over the country. And if I have the rights to be able to screen something online without geographic restrictions, I want people in the US, in Ireland, in Australia, everywhere else to enjoy the same film. And the online marketing model is very different, but it allows me to reach people in a different way. That accessibility side of the online conversation has just been like a really beautiful thing for us as cultural organizations. It just means that we can reach people in a new way, and in a way that's like, it's really easy to analyze where people come from. And you know, like if I do a screening in a cinema in central London, I'm going to give you a feedback form for you to rip on the way out and tell me what your experience was. I don't need to do that online because you're going to tell me with a click. Or I can send you an email survey, a follow-up or something, or you can vote for whether you like the film or not and give me a rating, and I can see where your IP address comes from. I know that you're in some city or another, or that you're one country or another, and it's just like, it's a really nice thing to be able to say, my online audience comes from here, my in-person audience is obviously from that town, but you know, they have a certain enjoyment of things. And yeah, it's a different way of doing things. It offers a different degree of accessibility in the sense that like, not everyone has the time or the money to come to the cinema of an evening, even if it's a big festival event. I want to be reaching those people who are at home with their kids, or, you know, can't come out or don't want to come out, but still want to access the culture. And the online platforms have been really revolutionary in allowing us to be able to do that. So I hope they stay.
That's all for this episode from me and Gerry. Hope you enjoyed it. Until next time.